On certain days, the unknown does not arrive in darkness. It appears in broad daylight, inside controlled airspace, surrounded by ships, radar systems, and trained observers whose profession depends on accurate perception. In November of 2004, a United States Navy carrier strike group was conducting routine exercises off the coast of Southern California. There was nothing unusual about the deployment, nothing experimental about the mission profile. Fighter pilots launched and recovered according to schedule. Radar operators monitored familiar patterns of movement across the Pacific training ranges. It was an environment built on expectation. Every object in the sky was supposed to be accounted for. Every signal was supposed to resolve into something known. And yet, days before the event that would later become public, radar systems aboard the USS Princeton began detecting objects that did not behave according to any recognized flight profile. They appeared at extreme altitude. Then, within seconds, they descended tens of thousands of feet, stopping abruptly above the ocean surface. Sometimes they hovered. Sometimes they disappeared entirely from the display, only to return minutes later at a different position. At first, the anomalies were treated as technical inconsistencies. Newly upgraded radar equipment can produce unfamiliar returns. Calibration errors are not uncommon when systems become more sensitive, but the contacts continued. They repeated patterns that felt deliberate, and they did so in one of the most monitored stretches of military airspace in the world. On the morning of November 14th, air defense controllers made a decision that would quietly enter aviation history. They asked fighter pilots already airborne on a training sortie to change course, not toward an identified threat, but toward something that could not yet be explained. What followed would unfold quickly, but the implications would take years to surface, because this was not an event witnessed by a single individual standing alone beneath an open sky. It was observed through instruments, tracked across multiple platforms, and experienced by people trained not to be surprised. In late 2004, the USS Nimitz carrier strike group was operating in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Southern California. This was not an unusual deployment zone. The region had long been used for advanced training exercises, a controlled environment where naval aviators could rehearse complex combat scenarios, test coordination procedures, and refine the precision expected in modern aerial warfare. A carrier strike group functions as a moving ecosystem of surveillance and response. Destroyers extend the fleet's radar horizon. Cruisers coordinate air defense. Aircraft launch in carefully timed cycles, their movements tracked continuously from takeoff to recovery. Every flight has a purpose. Every radar return has a classification. Every deviation is expected to resolve into a known explanation. At the time, one of the key vessels accompanying the Nimitz was the guided missile cruiser USS Princeton. Unlike earlier generations of naval radar, the Princeton had recently received significant system upgrades. Its sensors were now capable of detecting smaller objects at greater distances and higher altitudes. Where older displays might have filtered out ambiguous signals as background noise, the new system presented operators with a more detailed, and sometimes more confusing, picture of the sky. In the days leading up to November 14th, radar operators began noticing intermittent contacts. They were not consistent enough to be immediately classified as aircraft, nor were they random enough to be dismissed entirely. The objects appeared suddenly at extreme altitude, sometimes estimated above 60,000 or even 80,000 feet. Then, without following a gradual descent profile, they would drop rapidly toward the ocean surface. There were no visible transponder codes, no filed flight plans, no predictable vector or holding pattern, just brief appearances. Controlled airspace is designed to reduce uncertainty. Training ranges exist precisely so that unknown variables can be minimized. But uncertainty has a way of entering systems quietly. At first, the contacts were discussed in technical language. Possible calibration issues, atmospheric interference, software interpretation errors. No one on board had any reason to assume they were observing something historically significant. They were professionals performing routine analysis. Yet the persistence of the anomalies began to change the tone of those discussions. Days passed, the contacts continued, and gradually, what had started as a question about equipment reliability began to feel like a question about reality itself. By the morning of November 14th, the unknown contacts were no longer an isolated curiosity. They had become a pattern. Radar operators aboard the USS Princeton were now observing objects that appeared to follow a behavior cycle, one that resisted conventional interpretation. The returns would first materialize at extreme altitude, high enough that commercial air traffic rarely operated there, high enough that only specialized reconnaissance platforms were expected to function comfortably. Then, within seconds, the objects would descend, not in a controlled glide, not in a spiraling loss of altitude, but in what seemed like a direct vertical movement, rapid enough to challenge the assumptions embedded in the tracking software itself. On the radar displays, the symbols simply dropped, from tens of thousands of feet to just above the surface of the Pacific Ocean, and then they would stop, hovering, maintaining position despite atmospheric conditions that should have introduced drift. Remaining visible long enough for operators to confirm the return was not a momentary glitch. Then, just as suddenly, the contact would vanish, not gradually fading beyond range, not accelerating along a predictable vector. It would simply no longer be there. In some cases, the same pattern would repeat minutes later at a different location, sometimes dozens of miles away. Each appearance forced a reassessment. Were multiple objects involved? Was the system misinterpreting altitude? Could atmospheric layers be distorting signal timing? These were the kinds of questions professionals are trained to ask before drawing conclusions. Inside the Combat Information Center, uncertainty did not manifest as alarm. It manifested as repetition. Operators adjusted filters, cross-checked sensor modes, compared observations with nearby vessels, and still, the returns continued. In military environments, unusual data is often treated as a problem to be solved through procedure. But procedure depends on the assumption that reality behaves consistently enough to be modeled. When contacts appear, descend, hover, and disappear without clear cause, the mind begins to move ahead of the instruments, not toward extraordinary explanations, but toward a quieter recognition that something is occurring faster than understanding can follow. Shortly after the anomalies were discussed during morning operations, two FA-18 Super Hornets were directed toward a new contact. The pilots had been preparing for routine training maneuvers, simulated engagements, controlled altitude changes, predictable targets. Instead, they were given revised coordinates. An object had been detected descending rapidly toward the ocean surface. No identification, no flight plan, no known exercise asset assigned to that position. As the aircraft approached the designated area, the pilots began scanning visually. At first, there was nothing in the sky. No contrails, no glint of metal catching sunlight, no movement against the distant blue horizon. What drew their attention instead was the water. Below them, the otherwise calm Pacific appeared disturbed, as though something large had just submerged or was moving just beneath the surface. A patch of churning white foam contrasted sharply against the surrounding dark blue. It was an anomaly in an environment that pilots are trained to read instinctively. Then, above that disturbance, one of the pilots noticed a shape. It was not triangular, not cylindrical in the way conventional aircraft fuselages are perceived. He would later describe it using a comparison that sounded almost inadequate for the moment. Like a tic-tac, a smooth, white, elongated object. No visible wings, no tail assembly, no exhaust plume, no markings that could suggest origin or function. It moved irregularly at first, shifting direction in short bursts, ascending slightly, then settling again, remaining within a confined area as though responding to something unseen. The pilots began a descending turn to position themselves for closer observation. This is a familiar procedure. Unknown aerial contacts are approached with caution but also with confidence. Speed, altitude, and sensor advantage typically provide control over the encounter. But as the lead pilot curved downward, the object appeared to react. It began to mirror the aircraft's movement, not gradually adjusting course in response to a perceived threat, but aligning with the turn in a way that suggested instantaneous awareness of the jet's trajectory. For several seconds, the two paths seemed linked, one craft executing a controlled, trained maneuver, the other matching it with effortless precision. There was no radio communication from the object, no signal warning systems activated, no sense of aggression, only behavior that resisted categorization. Then, just as the pilot prepared to tighten the turn and close distance, the object accelerated, not with the rising arc typical of high-performance flight, not with visible propulsion or sonic disturbance. It simply departed, crossing the visible field in a fraction of a moment, vanishing toward a point in space that would later correspond to a pre-assigned training location, as though it had anticipated where the aircraft intended to go next. Inside the cockpit, the experience did not register as fear. It registered as disorientation, because every frame of reference the pilot relied upon, speed, inertia, aerodynamic limitation, had just been quietly contradicted. Later that day, another aircraft was launched to investigate the continuing radar contacts. This time, the pilot was equipped not only with visual search responsibility, but with advanced targeting systems designed to acquire, track, and record aerial objects under a wide range of conditions. Among these systems was a forward-looking infrared sensor, commonly referred to as FLIR. Unlike the human eye, which depends on reflected light and clear atmospheric conditions, infrared tracking can detect temperature contrast and motion signatures at significant distances. It is a technology developed precisely to reduce ambiguity, to transform uncertain shapes into measurable data. As the aircraft moved into the area indicated by radar operators, a small object was eventually detected within the sensor's field of view. On the display, it appeared as a compact oval form, featureless, lacking visible aerodynamic surfaces, maintaining steady movement against strong upper-level winds that would typically introduce drift or instability. Attempts were made to achieve a stable tracking lock. This process is routine. The pilot aligns the sensor, adjusts magnification, engages automated tracking modes that allow onboard systems to calculate trajectory, speed, and potential threat classification. But the lock did not hold. The object shifted unpredictably, at times seeming to rotate or reorient without following the gradual motion expected of conventional craft. Audio recorded during the engagement captured a mixture of professional focus and restrained surprise. There was no panic in the cockpit, no dramatic escalation in tone, only the subtle recognition that the systems designed to simplify aerial encounters were struggling to interpret what they were seeing. Then, as abruptly as previous contacts had vanished from radar displays, the object accelerated beyond the sensor's ability to maintain track. One moment it was present, the next, it was no longer within the measurable environment. Video data would later circulate publicly, compressed into brief clips that invited analysis from engineers, skeptics, enthusiasts, and institutions alike. Frame by frame, observers searched for conventional explanations: camera artifacts, parallax effects, sensor limitations. These discussions would continue for years. But inside the aircraft, during those few minutes of attempted tracking, the experience was less about proving the extraordinary and more about confronting the limits of instrumentation. In modern aviation, technology is expected to remove doubt. On that day, it did something more unsettling. It documented uncertainty. Following the encounters, the immediate priority within the carrier strike group was not public explanation. It was procedural clarity. Pilots completed post-flight debriefings. Radar operators reviewed logs. Supervisors assessed whether the anomalous contacts represented equipment malfunction, unannounced military testing, or a transient environmental factor that had briefly disrupted normal tracking assumptions. In structured organizations, unusual events are absorbed through documentation. Reports are filed. Language is standardized. Observations are reduced to sequences of timestamps, coordinates, and technical qualifiers. This process is designed to remove emotional interpretation, to transform experience into record. Yet not all records move forward with equal momentum. Some are acknowledged, discussed informally, and then set aside as operational priorities shift. Training schedules continue. Maintenance cycles demand attention. New missions replace unresolved questions. Among personnel involved in the November encounters, the incident did not immediately become a defining moment. It existed as a shared reference point, unusual, difficult to categorize, but not accompanied by clear instruction regarding long-term investigation. There were later suggestions that certain radar data or recordings may not have been preserved in the way participants expected. Whether due to routine overriding procedures, classification handling, or simple administrative friction, the event gradually receded from formal emphasis. This, too, is not uncommon. Large systems are designed for continuity. They are optimized to respond to threats that can be measured, anticipated, and prioritized. Events that resist classification can become organizational outliers, remembered by individuals, but only lightly embedded in institutional memory. Years would pass before the encounter re-emerged beyond naval aviation circles. When it did, it would do so in a cultural environment far more prepared to consider the possibility that advanced technology, human perception, and unexplained observation might intersect in ways that were once quietly set aside. By then, the pilots had continued their careers. The ships had completed additional deployments. The Pacific training ranges remained active. But the question raised during those minutes above the ocean had not been fully resolved. It had simply been archived, not as a confirmed threat, nor as a dismissed illusion, but as an event that had moved through the command chain without ever arriving at certainty. For more than a decade, the encounter remained largely contained within professional memory. Among pilots, radar operators, and a small number of defense personnel, the events of November 2004 were discussed occasionally, not as evidence of a specific conclusion, but as an experience that had resisted closure. Outside those circles, the wider public had little awareness that anything unusual had occurred. The early 21st century was already saturated with information. Conflicts dominated headlines. Technological optimism shaped cultural expectations. Mystery, when it appeared, was often treated as entertainment rather than inquiry. But in December of 2017, the atmosphere surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena began to change. Investigative reporting revealed the existence of a previously little-known Pentagon program tasked with examining encounters involving unknown objects observed by military personnel. Alongside the reports, short video clips recorded by naval aviators were released into public circulation. Grainy monochrome imagery, targeting symbology, fragments of cockpit audio. For many viewers, the footage seemed inconclusive. For those who had participated in the original events, it represented something else entirely. Recognition. A moment that had once existed as a quiet professional anomaly was now entering cultural consciousness. The language used by officials also began to shift. Terms like unidentified aerial phenomena replaced older expressions that carried stronger associations with speculation or ridicule. Statements became more measured, acknowledging observation without asserting explanation. Committees were formed. Briefings were conducted. Sensor data from additional incidents was reviewed with renewed attention. This did not resolve the mystery. If anything, it normalized uncertainty. What had once been treated as an isolated curiosity now appeared as part of a broader pattern, encounters in which trained observers, supported by advanced instrumentation, reported objects whose behavior challenged conventional aerospace understanding. The Nimitz Encounter became one reference point among many, not definitive, not singular, but symbolically important. It suggested that the unknown had not disappeared with the advance of surveillance technology. It had simply become more difficult to ignore. In this new environment, ambiguity was no longer confined to late-night conversations or regional folklore. It was discussed in formal hearings, analyzed in research papers, considered within institutions built on the assumption that the sky can be monitored comprehensively. And yet, even with this shift in tone, the central experience remained unchanged. An object observed, tracked, approached, and ultimately not understood. In the decades since the encounter off the California coast, the world has grown increasingly confident in its ability to observe itself. Satellites trace invisible grids across the atmosphere. Civilian aircraft broadcast their positions continuously. Sensor networks, military and commercial, map movement with a precision that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. We live inside an era of monitored skies, an era in which uncertainty is expected to shrink as instrumentation improves, as data becomes more abundant, as anomalies are reduced to solvable technical problems. And yet events like the Nimitz Encounter suggest a quieter possibility. That observation does not always lead immediately to understanding. The pilots who approached the object did not lack experience. The radar operators who tracked it did not lack training. The systems attempting to measure its movement were not experimental curiosities. They were the operational tools of a technologically advanced civilization. Still, for a brief interval above the Pacific Ocean, certainty receded. Speed could be recorded, but not explained. Trajectory could be described, but not predicted. Presence could be confirmed, but not categorized. Perhaps this is the deeper significance of such encounters. Not that they point toward a specific conclusion, but that they reveal the limits of frameworks we assume are complete. Modern society often equates visibility with comprehension. If something can be seen, it can be understood. If it can be measured, it can be controlled. Yet history offers repeated reminders that perception is only the first stage of knowledge. Meaning arrives later, sometimes years later, sometimes not at all. The unknown has not vanished from human experience. It has migrated from distant myths and uncharted territories into the data streams and sensor displays of the present day. In this sense, the Nimitz Encounter was not an interruption of technological progress. It was a reflection of it, a moment in which advanced systems did exactly what they were designed to do. They detected something and left us with the responsibility of deciding what detection actually means. For now, the record remains open, tracked, witnessed, discussed, but not resolved. Out at sea, training operations continued, aircraft launched, aircraft recovered, radar screens filled with familiar symbols moving along familiar paths. The disturbance on the water had long since dissolved back into the surface of the Pacific. Whatever had been tracked that morning no longer occupied physical space in any measurable way. For those who witnessed the encounter, the experience did not transform into certainty. It settled instead into a quieter category. Something remembered, something occasionally revisited in conversation or in the silent reconstruction of events during long flights and late-watch rotations. Years later, fragments of that morning would surface in public view. Video clips analyzed frame by frame. Testimonies compared against evolving aerospace theory. Institutions acknowledging that observation does not always arrive with immediate explanation. But the essential moment remains unchanged. A controlled environment, reliable instruments, professionals trained to interpret the sky, and a brief interval in which interpretation failed to keep pace with reality. Encounters like this do not end when objects disappear. They persist as questions. Not urgent enough to disrupt daily life, not simple enough to dismiss entirely. They become part of the background architecture of modern awareness, reminders that even within monitored airspace, even within systems designed for total visibility, there are still events that resist completion. For now, the transmission closes here. The record continues elsewhere.